It's a little known fact that the first Ebola patient to come through the U.S. passed through Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Join me today on Roundtable Perspective when I talk to Dr. Suzet McKinney about Chicago's preparedness for natural and man-made disasters, including tornadoes striking the city, the Missouri fault line, and other types of biological threats. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Suzet McKinney. We're here to talk about the Illinois Medical District, which you are the
CEO
and
Executive Director.
Okay, and Dr. McKinney has a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago School of Public Health with a focus on preparedness planning, leadership, and workforce development. So we're going to talk about wildfires and Ebola and things like that. But first, tell us about the district. What does that encompass?
So the Illinois Medical District is a 560-acre special use zoning district. We are dedicated to healthcare, health education, biotechnology, and technology innovation. We are a 24/7, 365, 7-day-a-week environment that includes 4 anchor institutions, all hospitals, biomedical research laboratories, a biomedical business incubator, as well as over 40 other healthcare-related facilities.
Okay, that's a lot.
It is a lot.
I understand there was an Ebola outbreak in Chicago.
There was.
Because that might give us an insight into how your organization works. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, there was an Ebola scare across the entire U.S. as a result of an extensive Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2015, and then the U.S. had a traveler from West Africa come to the United States. That traveler did not disclose his contact with an infected patient while he was in West Africa, and he became the first case of Ebola in the United States. Here in Chicago, in our area.
It landed on your desk, huh?
Well, what happened was that one case sparked a concern across the United States with regard to the introduction of emerging infectious diseases into the population here in the U.S. as a result of the global interconnectedness that we now enjoy. Here in the Chicago and Illinois region, we actually became one of only 5 cities in the U.S. where travelers were allowed to enter the United States. So once the outbreak occurred, the State Department and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security rerouted all international travel, such that if any person or group of persons were traveling to the United States from West Africa, they could only do so through 5 international airports, and Chicago O'Hare was one.
So that's why probably that person was routed here. So what was your role in this? How did you find out about it? You know, was it like the movies? Was it like Contagion and Outbreak?
Well, I always tell my students that Contagion is the most realistic example of how one of these outbreaks would occur. But my role during the Ebola outbreak was actually quite extensive. At the time, I was serving as the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Public Health Preparedness and Emergency Response at the Chicago Department of Public Health. So in that role, I had the responsibility of being in charge of our operational response to the Ebola outbreak. In that role, I was responsible for sending members of my team to O'Hare Airport, specifically to work along the professionals at CDC's quarantine office there at the airport to conduct screening of patients arriving from West Africa.
So they knew this person had Ebola before the plane landed, or?
No.
After.
So this person actually went to Texas. He was hospitalized in Dallas.
I see. I remember that.
However, again, because Chicago was one of only 5 points of entry, we had to have advanced screening at O'Hare Airport, and for any patients, or any travelers, I should say, who were suspected to be at increased risk of disease, became patients under investigation. And so we had to hospitalize those patients until
the people on the flight with this passenger?
Well, all persons on a flight from West Africa had to be screened.
I see. Okay.
If there were some that did not pass their initial screenings and needed further testing and evaluation, then they would be hospitalized, and we were also responsible for caring for any of their travel companions or family members.
Now, in the movies, they're in special units, and they're wearing these white suits, and the air is being, do we have an area like that here in Chicago?
We do.
Really?
In fact,
Where?
we had 4 hospitals that had areas like that during the Ebola outbreak, and all of the medical staff at those 4 hospitals had to undergo special training so that they could learn how to don and doff, or in layman's terms, put on and remove their personal protective equipment. And we also had to ensure that there were dedicated medical supplies and medical equipment specifically for those patients that were under investigation.
I think I'll sleep a little better knowing this. When nothing's going on, I assume the rest of your year is spent preparing for these things, right? What goes on to prepare for something like that during the year?
Well, typically we talk about something that we call the preparedness cycle. The preparedness cycle is a continuous cycle for how you prepare for emergencies and disasters. And it starts with the assessment of any emergencies or disasters that a particular community or jurisdiction might be at increased risk for. Once your hazards and your vulnerabilities are identified, then you develop emergency response plans to address each of those hazards. Once those plans are developed, then you have to train all of your public safety personnel on how to execute the plan. And then I'm sure you've heard about drills and exercises being conducted. That is a mechanism for testing those plans and practicing what the first responders would need to do. And at the conclusion of those practice drills and practice exercises, you evaluate how well it went, and any lessons that you learned, you recycle those lessons back into the planning process. So it's a continuous cycle.
And it's a business.
Absolutely.
It's not just you're not just working when there's an emergency, obviously.
That's correct.
I'm just curious. I mean, what if something happens and it gets out of control? Somebody drives into Chicago with a highly contagious disease, and it starts to spread. Do you become the mayor of Chicago? Do you have supreme authority? Can you call in the National Guard and all that?
Actually, there are mechanisms in place for disaster declarations. Chicago is a home rule city, so our mayor has the ability to declare a local disaster. But moving beyond
after he checks with you.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far.
All right.
He's a pretty smart guy.
Is he? Okay.
Yes, he is. But beyond a local jurisdiction, the governor of every state in the U.S. has the ability to declare a statewide emergency. Right. And then obviously moving up from there, the President of the United States and the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services can declare a public health emergency, which at that point opens up any number of resources that are available to the affected jurisdictions for mitigation of that emergency event.
Okay, and without getting too crazy here, I'll go on to something else, but I'm just curious. Given what you know, do you think something like that could happen?
Well, I think New York City is a perfect example, even today, that something like that could happen. The possibility, it's entirely possible. And that's why it's so important that our local and state governments continuously work to prepare for these types of emergencies.
Well, it's good to know that we're doing that. On another subject, right now one of the big issues is wildfires. They're spreading all over the West. They seem to get worse every year. Is this something that you're concerned with in Chicago? Can something like this happen around here?
Well, wildfires is not one of the types of emergencies that has been identified in our hazard and vulnerability assessment as something that is high probability for Chicago.
Sure.
Obviously for California, their situation is a little bit different, but wildfires is not an emergency event that we expect to see in Chicago.
It is the city that burned to the ground at one point in its history,
that is true.
Is it possible for a major city like Chicago to have a fire that spreads like that?
Not at the degree and the level within which it's spreading in California.
Right.
You have to understand California is a state that frequently has to deal with extremely dry conditions, with drought situations, and they have much more or greater areas with shrubbery and trees and
because
other types
of the natural
of greenery. Exactly.
Things around it. But I just mean just in terms of cities. I know I think it was around 2000 the LaSalle Bank building had a high-rise fire, I think the 22nd floor, and the flames were shooting out. If one catches fire, can that spread, or is it the nature of modern cities that things are going to be fairly isolated?
Yeah, I think the nature of modern cities, things would be fairly isolated, but I would also say for a city like Chicago, their fire department is a very sophisticated department. They have a lot of sophisticated equipment and equipment that would assist them in suppressing a fire of that magnitude in a high-rise building, for example. Now, that is not to say that situations don't occur where fires can spread from one building or one facility to the next. But again, with the mutual aid system that we have across the state of Illinois, they have the opportunity to get assistance from neighboring fire departments in neighboring jurisdictions. And again, I think in large cities and the communities that surround them, fire suppression techniques are quite sophisticated for the types of facilities that we see in this environment.
Okay. So we don't have to worry about Mrs. O'Leary's cow anymore.
I don't think so.
Okay, good. What are other concerns in Chicago? What do you spend time on?
Well, we spend a lot of time on extreme weather emergencies, extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme storms. We also spend a lot of time on infectious disease outbreaks, particularly outbreaks of diseases that are emerging or re-emerging. So things like novel strains of influenza, strains that have the potential to reach pandemic levels. H1N1 in 2009 and 2010 was an example of that. We've also seen over the years a number of measles outbreaks. And in addition to that, Chicago would be not so concerned about hurricanes like we see in some of the southern states, but more concerned about things like tornadoes. We've learned that tornadoes have the ability to bounce off buildings. And so that would be a large concern in a city that has a lot of high-rise structures.
Are the high-rise structures, I know they're built to handle a lot of things, minor earthquakes, things like that. Are they built to handle a tornado if that were to happen?
Well, I think they're built to handle a tornado, but I think what we are seeing now across the U.S. is greater severity of storms, more severe storms, the scope and breadth and depth of the storms are getting greater. And you can choose, almost any city or any jurisdiction, and we've seen an example. So I would say starting all the way back in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf states, 2010 we had the Joplin, Missouri tornado that completely devastated the city of Joplin. And then this year, in 2017, the hurricanes that we've seen once again in Texas and other parts of the Gulf region, the storms that we're seeing are just much more severe.
Yeah. I was actually in a park when the Plainfield hurricane hit.
Okay.
And I saw it come in. It was a breathtaking thing to watch. Well, what about things like earthquakes? I know there's supposedly a Missouri fault line that runs up through Chicago. Do you have concerns about that, or the precautions we take for that?
Absolutely. Earthquakes would be another natural disaster that we are concerned about in this area. As I understand, there is a major seismic fault line that runs right through Illinois, and Chicago would be affected as well. And we actually did experience an earthquake here just a few years ago. It was very minor, and there wasn't much damage or destruction that resulted from that earthquake. But I think for those of us who work in the public safety environment, it was just a reminder that that is a real hazard and a real concern. It's not just California that needs to be concerned about earthquakes.
Well, I mean, the one for California, they talk about the half of the state falling into the ocean and things like that. I mean, are those exaggerations?
No, I think that's a myth.
Yeah. So I mean, what's the potential damage?
I think in emergencies such as earthquakes, we would obviously be concerned with critical infrastructure, particularly things like bridges, our waterways, water systems, telecommunication systems, and just the physical infrastructure of the built environment. So safety of buildings, hospitals would be a great concern because that would be our first line of defense for injuries and illnesses. An earthquake is one of those types of disasters where we would expect to see quite a bit of traumatic injury. And so that makes the integrity of our hospital facilities critically important in one of those types of events.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a second. I'm sure a big part of your job is interfacing with the medical community, the hospitals and things like that. What is that like? What's that scope of the job?
Well, we talk about emergency preparedness from a public health perspective, but emergency preparedness from a hospital and healthcare perspective is equally as important. And once again, that's because our healthcare providers will be the first line of defense in many of these types of emergencies. So we have to be sure that hospitals have the ability to have proper staffing in an emergency, that they have procedures in place for recalling staff that might be on vacation or off work. We have to ensure that hospitals have full capability for medical surge. And for anyone who doesn't know what that term means, that's the ability to surge above and beyond the number of patients that they typically see from one day to the next. But we also want to be sure for the purposes of medical surge that hospitals have capability to very quickly identify volunteer health professionals who can come in and augment their response, that those healthcare workers have the proper medication so that they are not placed at increased risk, but also have proper personal protective equipment so that they protect themselves from any risk of disease in the event that they are treating patients that may have some highly pathogenic disease. And so
that's a really broad scope.
it is a very broad scope, but I think it speaks to the nature of some of these emergencies that we would have to deal with and the broad planning that is placed on hospitals. Other things like decontamination for both ambulatory patients and non-ambulatory patients would be a big issue in, say, for example, a chemical terrorism attack or a radiological attack. So these are not small emergencies, but these are not small steps that hospitals would have to take to prepare for them either.
So I imagine these sorts of precautions were stepped up after 9/11. Is that a fair point to pick as a turning point here?
Absolutely.
How much more prepared are we now than then?
Well, I think we are a lot more prepared than we were in 2001. But I think what was critical after 9/11 was the recognition that the public health infrastructure in the United States was severely, severely depleted to the point that we would not, at that time, have been able to manage a large-scale bioterrorism attack on this country. And so,
which we thought might have been happening. Weren't there packages of
there was
it anthrax
the
that was being mailed around?
Yeah. Yes, and that actually occurred just 3 weeks after 9/11.
Right, they seem to be connected, but I don't remember that any connection was turned up, right?
No connection between the two. But again, you know, it was a stark realization for the federal government and for our country that we really needed to take aggressive efforts to improve the public health infrastructure. And so it was really at that time that Congress appropriated additional funding to be funneled both into public health as well as into the healthcare system, specifically to prepare for emergency and disaster events. And so here we are now, 15 years, 16 years after those two events occurred, and I think we've come a long way. But I think what we've also seen is greater frequency of large-scale disasters, again, greater scope. Storms are becoming more severe. Our heat and other weather-related emergencies are becoming more severe. And in the case of New York City, terrorist activity continues to be a persistent problem.
Right.
So again, it just speaks to the need for us to continuously prepare and continuously improve all of the work that we've been doing for so long.
Now, your organization predates 9/11, right?
That's correct.
You go back to the 1940s?
1941.
Okay, good. So how has that evolved? I mean, what's different?
Well, my organization now, the Illinois Medical District, their work is not, our work is not focused solely on disasters and emergencies. the district was actually established for the sole purpose of being a hub within the city for healthcare, health education, biotechnology, and technology innovation. And so what we do now really speaks to a lot of the education and practical aspects of training, the next generation of healthcare workers, healthcare leaders. But because we do live in a society where these large-scale emergencies are of such high concern, the hospitals in the medical district have much more increased capacity at this point than what they had, certainly back in 1941, but even greater capacity than what they had in 2001 when we saw the anthrax
Probably
attack.
anticipating the war in 1941.
Maybe so.
Yeah. Well, so your scope of responsibilities, as I said, it seems to be pretty broad here.
Yes.
How do you implement that? What authority do you have to go to a hospital and question their preparedness and tell them what you think about it? How does that work?
Well, I try not to exert authority in a punitive manner when it is not necessary to do so. But I think at this point, particularly because of the society within which we live, hospitals and their leadership recognize and understand the types of threats that we face. And so when I go into a hospital and I talk to them about collaborative work in a particular area, there is a general understanding of why the need is present. And so I have found that makes it a lot easier to get hospitals to work together in a more collaborative fashion. But we also engage a number of other external partners. As I mentioned, the VA Medical Center is in the medical district. And so, and also because of the work that I have been fortunate enough to do on a national level, we have increased partnerships with multiple organizations within the federal government to really work and ensure that hospitals and many of our other partners are developing the type of capability that would be needed to respond to one of these large-scale attacks, or if the attack or the emergency was something that was more localized to our area. We are very proud that the Chicago and Northwestern Indiana chapter of the American Red Cross is in the medical district, and they maintain the blood bank capabilities for the entire Midwest region, and so they are another critical partner for us.
Right. So we just have a couple of minutes left. Something we haven't talked about that you think we might bring up, some other aspect of the job?
Well, I think what I would like to bring up, or stress I should say, is really just the importance of what in our industry we call the whole community response to emergencies, and the whole community approach to preparedness. And what that simply means is that when preparing for emergencies and disasters, the responsibility doesn't lie solely with the government, but instead everyone has a part that they can play in both preparing for emergencies and disasters as well as in responding. So that means nonprofit organizations working alongside government institutions, academia, but also the private business sector, as well as faith-based organizations, social service organizations, and communities, all the way down to the individual. And so I think the more that we all educate ourselves on the types of emergencies and disasters that our communities are most prone to, the better off we'll be, because then you can educate yourself on basic preparedness initiatives and actions that can be taken at home, in a community, in your school, in the workplace, and even in your social settings that will go a long way in protecting all of the health and safety of our full communities and places where we spend our time each day.
So say a minister or a Cub Scout troop leader, somebody in the community wants to know what they could do to be ready and be part of this. What resources are there for them?
There are so many resources out there. From a health perspective, there is the Centers for Disease Control, as well as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but there are also your local public health department, your state public health department, as well as your local and state emergency management agencies.
So I would go online, I would look up one of these, I would contact them. Would
That's
they
right.
be inviting me to a seminar? Would they give me pamphlets? How does that work?
Well, before you contact them, there should be a wealth of information on their website. Other websites such as the American Red Cross and ready.gov will have checklists on their website that can be printed out or that you can review, and it'll tell you actions that you need to take. Sometimes your local or state public health department or emergency management agency may have a workshop or a seminar designed for the community. And of course, you can attend those seminars and those workshops and learn more. And finally, there is always the community emergency response team. Most communities have them now, but those are organized emergency response teams that any member of the public can volunteer to join.
Sure.
And through joining one of those response teams, you will receive all types of training and information that you can use and share in your community.
Well, that's good direction. Thank you very much.
No problem.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. McKinney for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.